You're a royal physician in the Palace of Madrid, and the year is 1834. The king is dead, but your work isn't finished. In a chilling, hushed ritual, you've been summoned to the private chambers of the late Ferdinand VII, a task so bizarre and unprecedented that you question your own sanity. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, stands before you, her eyes red from weeping, her face a mask of grief. Yet beneath the sorrow is a resolve as cold and hard as granite. She makes a request that chills your blood, a command to perform an act of preservation so strange, so intimate, it feels like a violation of the dead. Your hands tremble as you approach the bed where Ferdinand's body lies. Even in death, the man who terrorized Spain for 2 decades seems to mock you from beyond the grave. His reign, a grotesque pageant of political reversals and ruthless purges, has ended. But it's not his face, nor the marks of his final illness, that draws your attention. It's what lies beneath the silk sheets, the thing that defined his reign as much as his cruelty, his paranoia, or his betrayals. It is the anatomical monstrosity that historians would whisper about for centuries, but never dare write in their official accounts. The thing that was simultaneously the source of his deepest shame and his most twisted pride. Ferdinand VII's member. His grotesquely oversized, bizarrely shaped endowment. You realize you're not just preserving flesh and blood. You're preserving the physical embodiment of a reign that was itself deformed, oversized, and ultimately destructive to everything it touched. As you begin the delicate, nauseating preservation process, your mind wanders to the stories you've heard whispered in the palace corridors. Stories of special cushions, of screaming wives, of desperate attempts to produce an heir despite nature's cruel joke. The whispers and rumors that have circled the throne for decades now take on a horrifying, tangible reality. To understand Ferdinand VII, you must first understand that he was born cursed, not by witchcraft or divine wrath, but by the poisonous legacy of centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons, in their desperate and misguided quest to preserve the purity of their bloodlines, had spent generations marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces. It was a genetic lottery rigged for disaster, a slow, generational poison that manifested in everything from mental instability to physical deformities. This incestuous web of relationships, born of political convenience and a misguided sense of divine right, created a human tragedy. Ferdinand emerged from this toxic bloodline like a living embodiment of royal decay. Born at El Escorial Palace on October 14, 1784, he was the product of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, a couple whose own marriage was an arrangement between first cousins. The genetic lottery had been rigged from the start, and Ferdinand would pay the price in the most intimate and humiliating way possible. His birth was hailed as a blessing, a promise of a future king for Spain, yet hidden within his very DNA was a ticking time bomb. As he grew from child to adolescent, it became clear that nature had played a particularly cruel joke on the future king of Spain. His member began developing in ways that defied medical understanding. By his teenage years, court physicians were already whispering about the royal anomaly, a monstrously oversized and strangely shaped organ that seemed almost alien in its proportions. These were men of science, yet they spoke of his condition with a mixture of clinical detachment and profound revulsion. The medical records, hidden away in Vatican archives for centuries, describe Ferdinand's endowment in clinical terms that nonetheless convey the horror of his condition. One physician wrote, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove challenging." Another was more blunt. "The princess organ resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." The psychological impact on young Ferdinand was devastating. In an era when male anatomy was judged by classical Greek and Roman standards, where smaller and more refined was considered a mark of aristocracy and intellectual prowess. Ferdinand's massive, misshapen member marked him as a freak of nature. The very thing that modern men might envy became a source of profound shame and humiliation for the future king of Spain. His body was a source of mockery, a physical manifestation of the decay that had poisoned his family for generations. And from this deep well of shame, a monster was born. Ferdinand's childhood was a masterclass in dysfunction, a crucible that would have broken a stronger man and instead forged a tyrant. His father, Charles IV, was weak-willed and intellectually lazy, preferring to spend his days hunting rather than ruling his vast empire. His mother, Maria Louisa, was a woman of voracious appetites and an unapologetic libertine who openly flaunted her affair with Manuel de Godoy, the Queen's favorite and Spain's de facto ruler. Young Ferdinand watched this daily humiliation, absorbing lessons about power, betrayal, and the weakness of trust. He saw how his father's passive nature left him vulnerable, and how his mother's open indiscretions made her a figure of both pity and scorn. But it was his physical abnormality that truly shaped his character. The whispers of the court were a constant, corrosive presence. Servants giggled behind their hands. Courtiers made subtle jokes that flew over his father's head, but landed like daggers in Ferdinand's heart. Foreign diplomats, ever observant, reported back to their masters about the Spanish embarrassment, a prince whose body was as deformed as his kingdom. Ferdinand learned early that he was an object of mockery, that his most intimate self was a source of amusement for others. This humiliation bred a deep, festering resentment that would later manifest in his treatment of Spain itself. He began to see mockery everywhere, in the respectful bows of his subjects, in the formal addresses of his tutors, in the arranged smiles of potential brides. His paranoia wasn't entirely unjustified. People really were laughing at him, just not always for the reasons he imagined. The prince's tutors noticed disturbing changes in his behavior as he entered adolescence. He became secretive, vindictive, and cruel to those who served him. Servants who displeased him would find themselves dismissed, or worse. Ferdinand was learning to use the power of his position to compensate for the powerlessness he felt about his body. One particular incident, recorded in the memoirs of a court chaplain, reveals the darkness growing in Ferdinand's soul. When a young page accidentally walked in on the prince changing clothes, Ferdinand didn't simply dismiss him. He had the boy flogged and his family exiled from Madrid. The message was clear and brutal. No one could witness the prince's shame and remain unpunished. As Ferdinand reached marriageable age, the full extent of his anatomical challenge became clear to the royal physicians. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal doctor, left behind secret notes that provide a disturbing window into the medical reality of Ferdinand's condition. His Majesty's member, Flores wrote, presents a most unusual configuration. The base measures no more than the width of a man's thumb, yet it expands to a circumference that defies natural proportion. The length exceeds that of any recorded human specimen, measuring near to 10 inches in its natural state, and growing considerably larger when aroused. Most concerning is the peculiar curvature, in the presence of what appear to be additional tissue growths that serve no discernible biological function. The implications for Ferdinand's future as a husband and father were immediately obvious. Normal intimate relations would be impossible without significant medical intervention and specialized equipment. The royal craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create what they euphemistically called marital aids, specially designed cushions and supports that would allow Ferdinand to function sexually without causing serious injury to his future wives. This was no simple commission. It was an engineering challenge born of perversity, requiring a level of discretion and ingenuity that a normal court would never demand. But the physical challenges were only part of the problem. Ferdinand's condition had psychological ramifications that went far beyond the bedroom. He became obsessed with potions and elixirs that promised to normalize his anatomy or enhance his fertility. Court alchemists and foreign physicians were secretly brought to Madrid, each promising miracle cures that inevitably failed. The prince spent fortunes on these quack remedies. He consumed mixtures of ground rhinoceros horn, powdered pearls, and rare herbs that were supposed to regulate his royal essence. Some potions were meant to shrink his member to normal proportions. Others claimed to enhance his virility despite its unusual shape. All of them were useless. But Ferdinand's desperation made him an easy mark for charlatans and con artists who preyed on his deepest insecurity. His condition wasn't just a physical ailment. It was a psychological and spiritual wound that refused to heal. In 1802, Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The match was arranged when both were still teenagers, and Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with the romantic notions of a sheltered royal bride. She had heard he was called the Desired One by some of his supporters and imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince. The wedding ceremony was magnificent, as befitted the union of two of Europe's most powerful royal houses. The cathedral was filled with music. The streets of Madrid echoed with celebration, and the young couple looked every inch the perfect royal partnership. Maria Antonia was beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely excited about her new life. Ferdinand, for his part, seemed almost normal in public, charming, attentive, and appropriately romantic. But royal weddings end, and wedding nights begin. The first sign of trouble came when Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with an unusual request. Special preparations were needed for the royal bedchamber. Equipment that the ladies did not understand, but were assured was customary for royal couples. Custom-made cushions were brought in, along with bottles of oils and salves, and various implements that seemed more medical than romantic. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent as most royal brides of her era, understood none of this. Her education had been strictly religious, focusing on languages, music, and courtly etiquette. The basic facts of married life had been explained to her in the vaguest possible terms by nervous older women who themselves knew little about the specific challenges she was about to face. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber, Maria Antonia's first glimpse of her husband's naked form sent her into hysterics. One lady-in-waiting, writing years later, described the scene. Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself. She backed against the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster! Monster!" until we feared she had lost her reason entirely. Ferdinand's member, described by witnesses as resembling a great club with a thin handle, was unlike anything the sheltered princess had imagined possible. The sheer size of it terrified her, but it was the bizarre shape, the way it curved and twisted, the strange growths along its length, the almost alien appearance of the whole apparatus that truly broke her composure. What followed was less a romantic wedding night than a medical procedure. Ferdinand's specially trained physicians had to be called in to explain to the horrified princess what would be required of her. The custom cushions were arranged, the oils applied, and a process began that was more akin to surgery than lovemaking. Contemporary accounts, hidden in private letters between court physicians, describe a scene of almost surreal dysfunction. Ferdinand required the specially designed pillow to support his massive member, preventing it from causing injury to himself during intimate relations. Even with these aids, the process was so traumatic for Maria Antonia that she required laudanum to endure it. The psychological impact on both partners was devastating. Ferdinand, already paranoid and insecure about his condition, became even more twisted when faced with his wife's obvious revulsion. Maria Antonia, meanwhile, developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe sexual trauma. She began taking larger and larger doses of laudanum, eventually becoming addicted to the substance as a way to escape the horror of her marital duties. Their attempt to produce an heir became a ritualized nightmare that repeated itself with tragic regularity. Ferdinand would summon his physicians, who would prepare the chamber with its specialized equipment. Maria Antonia would be dosed with enough laudanum to make her compliant, but not catatonic. The procedure would be performed with clinical efficiency, after which both parties would retreat to separate wings of the palace to recover from their ordeal. As months turned to years without a successful pregnancy, Ferdinand's desperation reached new heights. He became convinced that his wife's obvious disgust was somehow preventing conception, and he began experimenting with increasingly bizarre methods to overcome what he saw as her feminine weakness. Court records reveal that Ferdinand ordered the creation of special restraints that would hold Maria Antonia in position during their intimate encounters, preventing her from pulling away or expressing her revulsion. These leather and silk contraptions were crafted by the same artisans who made the king's sea saddles and hunting equipment, adding a particularly disturbing dimension to the royal workshops. The king also became obsessed with timing their encounters according to astrological charts and lunar cycles. He consulted with astronomers, astrologers, and even practitioners of darker arts who promised to align the stars in favor of royal conception. The palace became a haven for charlatans selling fertility potions, magical amulets, and ritual ceremonies that promised to overcome the curse of Ferdinand's deformed anatomy. One particularly desperate episode involved Ferdinand's consultation with a wandering mystic who claimed to be from the Orient. This supposed wise man convinced the king that his member's unusual shape was actually a sign of divine favor, that he was blessed with the dragon's rod, and needed only the proper rituals to unlock its fertility potential. For 3 months, Ferdinand subjected himself and his wife to bizarre ceremonies involving incense, chanting, and positions that were supposedly based on ancient Chinese texts. The palace, once a center of European Catholicism, had been transformed into a grotesque theater of pagan rites and perverted medical procedures. Twice, miraculously, Maria Antonia did become pregnant. The court rejoiced, Ferdinand's confidence soared, and Spain held its breath, waiting for the birth of an heir to the throne. But both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages that left the royal couple more traumatized than ever. The first miscarriage, in 1804, occurred in the 4th month of pregnancy. Court physicians attributed it to the unusual stresses placed upon Her Majesty's delicate constitution. What they meant, but could never say openly, was that Ferdinand's anatomical abnormality had made the sexual act so traumatic that Maria Antonia's body couldn't sustain a pregnancy to term. The second miscarriage, in 1805, was even more devastating. This time, Maria Antonia carried the child almost to full term before losing it in a labor so difficult and bloody that it nearly killed her. The queen never fully recovered from this ordeal, and her addiction to laudanum became so severe that she was essentially a walking ghost for the remaining 2 years of her life. Ferdinand's reaction to these losses revealed the true depths of his selfishness and cruelty. Rather than showing compassion for his wife's suffering, he became convinced that she was deliberately sabotaging their chances of producing an heir. He accused her of taking substances to prevent pregnancy, of deliberately moving in ways that would cause miscarriages, and of harboring secret liberal sympathies that made her unwilling to provide Spain with a proper Catholic heir. These accusations, whispered in the corridors of the palace, destroyed what little remained of Maria Antonia's mental health. She began to believe that she was indeed cursed, that her body was rejecting Ferdinand's seed because of some hidden sin or divine displeasure. Her last months were spent in almost constant prayer, begging forgiveness for sins she couldn't name and crimes she had never committed. When Maria Antonia died in May 1807 at the age of only 21, the official cause was listed as fever and complications from her delicate constitution. The truth was far darker. She had essentially died of despair, her body and mind destroyed by years of sexual trauma, drug addiction, and psychological abuse. But even in death, Maria Antonia couldn't escape the twisted world of Ferdinand's paranoia. Rumors immediately began circulating that she had been poisoned not by political enemies, but by Ferdinand himself, who had grown tired of her failures as a wife and wanted to start fresh with a new bride who might be more successful at producing an heir. These rumors were fueled by the suspicious death of the palace apothecary, who was found dead in his chambers just days after Maria Antonia's passing. He had left behind a cryptic letter that was immediately seized by Ferdinand's agents and never seen again. Some whispered that the letter contained confessions about poisons administered to the queen. Others believed it revealed the true nature of Ferdinand's medical condition and the impossible demands placed on his wife. The truth, in this web of suspicion and half-truths, was a moving target. What was clear was that a dark shadow had fallen over the palace, and Ferdinand's reign was just beginning. Ferdinand's behavior, following Maria Antonia's death, was telling. While he made the appropriate public displays of grief, privately he seemed almost relieved. Within weeks, he was already making inquiries about potential second wives, focusing particularly on women who had already proven their fertility by bearing children in previous marriages. He saw women not as partners, but as vessels for procreation, and his first wife had been a flawed tool that had failed to function properly. Now he sought a new instrument for his singular purpose. The king's physicians, meanwhile, were working frantically to develop new treatments for his condition. If Ferdinand was to remarry successfully, they needed to find ways to make intimate relations less traumatic for his future wives. This led to some of the most bizarre medical experiments in royal history, as doctors attempted to create ever more sophisticated marital aids and develop new surgical techniques that might reshape Ferdinand's anatomy. The lines between medical science and grotesque experimentation were completely blurred. As Ferdinand approached his second marriage, his character was already showing the twisted traits that would later make him one of history's most despised monarchs. The sexual trauma of his first marriage, combined with his deep-seated insecurities about his physical condition, had created a man incapable of genuine human connection or empathy. Ferdinand had learned to see other people not as individuals with their own feelings and needs, but as tools to be used for his pleasure or obstacles to be eliminated. His first wife had been a tool that failed to function properly and had to be discarded. His subjects were tools for maintaining his power and feeding his ego. Anyone who opposed him was an obstacle that needed to be destroyed. The prince's interactions with the palace staff revealed his growing sadism. He began testing the limits of his power by issuing increasingly arbitrary and cruel orders. Servants who accidentally glimpsed his naked form were not just dismissed, but often disappeared entirely. Guards who failed to maintain absolute secrecy about the royal chambers found themselves assigned to the most dangerous frontier postings in Spain's crumbling empire, a form of exile that was often a death sentence. Ferdinand also developed an obsession with the idea that people were constantly mocking him behind his back. This was an entirely paranoid. People really were talking about his condition, but Ferdinand's response was disproportionate and increasingly violent. He began maintaining lists of suspected mockers and planning elaborate revenge scenarios that he would implement once he had the power to do so. His personal shame had morphed into a political pathology. By 1807, Ferdinand had become the center of a complex conspiracy involving some of Spain's most powerful nobles and military officers. These men, known as the Fernandinos, saw the prince as their vehicle for overthrowing the weak government of Charles IV and his despised minister, Manuel de Godoy. What they didn't understand was that they were allying themselves with a man whose sexual dysfunction had created a personality disorder that would ultimately prove more dangerous than the incompetence they sought to replace. The conspirators worked tirelessly to build Ferdinand's reputation as the desired one. They spread propaganda about his intelligence, his patriotism, and his potential as a reformist king who would restore Spain to its former greatness. What they carefully concealed was their growing awareness of Ferdinand's psychological instability and his increasingly disturbing behavior toward anyone who crossed him. The conspiracy came to a head in October 1807 with the so-called El Escorial conspiracy, in which Ferdinand was caught planning to overthrow his own father with the help of Napoleon Bonaparte. When the plot was discovered, Ferdinand's response revealed both his cowardice and his complete lack of loyalty to anyone, including his co-conspirators, rather than standing by the men who had risked everything for his cause. Ferdinand immediately threw them all under the metaphorical carriage wheels. He provided detailed confessions about every aspect of the conspiracy, named every participant, and begged his parents for forgiveness. While his allies faced imprisonment and exile, this betrayal established a pattern that would define Ferdinand's entire reign. He would use people for his own purposes and then destroy them the moment it became convenient. His personal pathology had now become a public liability. Even as Ferdinand's political machinations were unfolding, his medical condition continued to worsen. Court physicians noted that his member was continuing to grow and change shape, developing new abnormalities that made intimate relations even more challenging. Some medical historians suggest that Ferdinand may have suffered from a rare condition called megaloi, a hormonal disorder that causes continued growth of male anatomy throughout adulthood. Whatever the medical explanation, the practical implications were clear. Ferdinand would need increasingly sophisticated aids and increasingly compliant wives if he was ever to produce an heir. This realization led to one of the most disturbing aspects of his later marriages, the deliberate selection of women who could be psychologically manipulated or physically coerced into accepting his demands. The palace craftsmen, meanwhile, had become specialists in creating ever more elaborate marital equipment. Their workshops, hidden away in the depths of the royal residence, resembled a bizarre combination of a medical laboratory and a torture chamber. They developed adjustable cushions, restraining devices, and various implements designed to make Ferdinand's sexual encounters possible while minimizing the physical damage to his partners. These craftsmen were sworn to absolute secrecy, and Ferdinand made sure their silence was maintained through a combination of generous payments and terrifying threats. Several artisans who worked on these projects were later found dead under mysterious circumstances, leading to rumors that Ferdinand had them killed to prevent any possibility of their revealing the true nature of their work. His personal shame had now become a state secret, enforced by terror and murder. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and forced Ferdinand to abdicate, the future king found himself in a uniquely humiliating position. Not only had he lost his throne, but he was now a prisoner whose captor was undoubtedly aware of his shameful medical condition. French intelligence had extensive files on the Spanish royal family, and Ferdinand's anatomical abnormality was certainly among the information they had gathered. The most powerful man in Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, was now privy to Ferdinand's most closely guarded secret. Ferdinand's 6 years of captivity at the Château de Valençay were marked by continued medical experimentation. French physicians studied his condition with scientific curiosity. These doctors, freed from the constraints of royal protocol that had limited their Spanish colleagues, conducted examinations and treatments that bordered on torture in their thoroughness. They saw Ferdinand not as a king, but as a medical anomaly, a fascinating case study in human genetics and anatomy. The French medical reports, discovered in Napoleonic archives centuries later, provide the most detailed clinical description of Ferdinand's condition ever recorded. They describe a sexual organ so large and misshapen that it seemed to belong to a creature from mythology rather than a human king. The French doctors theorized that Ferdinand's condition was the result of multiple genetic disorders combining in a single individual, creating what they called perfect storm of anatomical dysfunction. During his captivity, Ferdinand also received word of various Spanish nobles and military leaders who were fighting for his restoration. The irony was profound. Brave men were dying in muddy trenches and mountain passes to restore a king whose primary concern was finding new ways to manage his sexual dysfunction and produce an heir to continue his cursed bloodline. This disconnect between the suffering of his people and his personal obsessions was a defining feature of his character. He was a king whose body was a symbol of his kingdom's decay, yet he was completely unaware of the larger symbolic meaning of his condition. Ferdinand spent his exile years writing extensive letters to various European royalty, seeking potential brides who might be willing to accept his special circumstances. These letters, written in his own hand, reveal a man completely disconnected from the suffering of his people and obsessed entirely with his own intimate problems. While Spain burned and its people bled for his return, Ferdinand was planning his next wedding night. He was a prisoner of his own body, and in his desperate quest for an heir, he was willing to sacrifice anyone who stood in his way. He saw the world through the lens of his own pathology. The entire European continent was simply a field of potential partners and political obstacles in his personal quest for procreation. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, the crowds that greeted him were unlike anything Europe had ever seen. They threw flowers, wept with joy, and fell to their knees as his carriage passed. Children born during the war saw their first glimpse of the king their parents had died to restore. The very stones of Madrid themselves seemed to sing with celebration. Ferdinand smiled and waved from his carriage, a mask of regal calm, but his mind was already focused on more intimate concerns. His first priority wasn't governing Spain or rewarding those who had fought for his restoration. It was finding a new wife who could finally give him the heir that had eluded him for so long. The king's return also marked the beginning of what historians call the ominous decade. But the true ominousness lay not just in Ferdinand's political tyranny, but in his increasingly desperate and bizarre attempts to fulfill his royal duty of producing offspring. His sexual dysfunction had become inseparable from his political dysfunction, creating a ruler whose personal inadequacies manifested as a national catastrophe. Ferdinand's first act as restored king was to commission an entirely new set of marital aids from the finest craftsmen in Europe. He sent agents to Germany, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire seeking artisans who specialized in creating devices for delicate royal circumstances. The resulting collection, hidden away in secret chambers of the palace, represented the finest achievement of perverted ingenuity that the early 19th century could produce. It was a testament to his single-minded obsession, a grotesque museum of his own pathology. The second wife Ferdinand chose was Maria Isabel of Portugal, another cousin in the endless cycle of royal inbreeding that had cursed his bloodline. She was 19 when she arrived at the Spanish court in 1816, full of the naive hope that young princesses carried into these arranged marriages. The court physicians had already briefed her ladies-in-waiting about the special preparations that would be required for the wedding night, but nothing could have prepared Isabel for the reality of what awaited her. The wedding ceremony itself was a spectacle of Baroque excess, designed to mask the growing desperation of a king whose reign was becoming synonymous with failure. Ferdinand stood at the altar in cloth of gold, his face a mask of barely contained anxiety. He had spent the previous week consulting with physicians, alchemists, and even a mysterious figure rumored to be an Ottoman specialist in royal difficulties, who had arrived in Madrid under cover of darkness. The wedding night was a disaster that would haunt both participants for the rest of their short lives together. Despite all the preparations, all the devices, all the consultations with experts across Europe, Ferdinand's anatomical monstrosity proved as insurmountable as ever. The screams that echoed through the palace corridors that night were not screams of passion, but of genuine terror and pain. Servants found blood-stained sheets and broken furniture, evidence of a coupling that resembled a medieval torture session more than the romantic union of royalty. Isabel never recovered from that first night. Court observers noted that she developed a pronounced stutter and would flinch whenever Ferdinand entered a room. She began experiencing what palace physicians called hysterical episodes, but which modern understanding would recognize as severe trauma responses. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she often woke screaming from nightmares, calling out warnings about the monster that haunted her dreams. Ferdinand, meanwhile, interpreted his wife's terror as a personal insult to his royal dignity. His paranoia, already legendary, reached new heights as he convinced himself that Isabel was conspiring with foreign powers to mock his condition. He began having her correspondence intercepted, her food tasted for poisons, and her chambers searched for evidence of betrayal. The king's sexual dysfunction had metastasized into a political psychosis that infected every aspect of his rule. The pressure to produce an heir became an obsession that consumed both the royal couple and the Spanish court. Ferdinand commissioned a series of increasingly bizarre medical consultations, bringing together physicians, anatomists, and even circus performers who claimed expertise in unusual anatomical challenges. The royal bedchamber became a laboratory of sexual experimentation that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and dignity. One particularly disturbing account, found in the private diary of a court physician, describes Ferdinand's decision to invite foreign experts to observe his attempts at procreation. The king, desperate for solutions, allowed German anatomists and French physicians to witness his intimate failures, turning his marriage bed into a grotesque medical theater. These observers took detailed notes and made sketches that were later circulated among European medical schools, making Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction a subject of academic study across the continent. Isabel, subjected to this parade of voyeuristic medical consultation, began showing signs of complete psychological collapse. She stopped eating regularly, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and developed a 1,000-yard stare that servants found more frightening than her earlier outbursts. The young queen had become a living ghost, haunting the halls of a palace that had become her prison. The political consequences of Ferdinand's personal failures were becoming impossible to ignore. Spain's American colonies, already in revolt, pointed to their king's inability to produce legitimate heirs as evidence of divine displeasure with Bourbon rule. Revolutionary propaganda depicted Ferdinand as a sexually impotent tyrant whose physical defects symbolized the rottenness of his regime. Ferdinand's reign was a constant battle between his tyrannical need for absolute control and the humiliating physical reality of his condition. The two were inextricably linked, a toxic combination that led to political instability, brutal repression, and ultimately, a dynasty on the brink of collapse. The man who had been a freak of nature was now a freak of history, his personal misery a mirror for his country's tragic decline.